Welcome to Elevating La Cultura podcast, a space where I talk with Latinas who are passionate about what they do and are willing to share that passion with others to change the narrative, especially for the next generation. Each season is centered around different topics, but all with a Latina perspective. Welcome to Season 7. I'm so excited to share these stories and hope they will offer encouragement, wisdom, and be something that you can relate to. So vámonos, and let's get into it. Hola, we have our last guest of Season 7 today. Adriana is a queer Latinx psychotherapist and relationship educator. She holds a master's degree in counseling psychology, and drawing from her lived experiences as a first-gen daughter of immigrants, she has spent over 15 years honing her skills in helping individuals, couples, and adult families navigate the intricacies of life's transitions and challenges. Adriana understands the unique impact that intergenerational gifts and traumas and systemic oppression have on adults from diverse backgrounds, particularly those identifying as BIPOC and First-Gen. Through her inclusive and comprehensive approach to therapy, she cultivates self-compassion and empowers her clients by guiding them to understand their values. This enables them to design and create lives, careers, and relationships that are in harmony with those values and feel fulfilling and meaningful. Adriana is driven by her passion for aiding others in their journeys of self-discovery and personal growth. Please enjoy our conversation. Hi, I've been looking forward to this interview and this conversation since we met, I believe, about a month ago.
I think so.
Yeah, and I think I want to give a shout out to Kita again. She's on a previous podcast, but the community that she has built has been amazing, and I've been able to meet wonderful people like you. And so I'm so excited to chat with Adriana today and get into mental health. So before we get into it, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much to you and to Kita, because one of the things for me as an entrepreneur, as a person who comes from working in teams with lots of people, has been just sort of the loneliness and the isolation, right? And so how important it is to build community. And so about me, Adriana Rodriguez, my pronouns are she, her, hers, ella. I'm a Latinx, queer, immigrant, daughter of immigrants, first gen everything. First to go to college, first to move away, first to do, like, literally my life is one of first. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of California, and I have been licensed for almost 10 years now. So I've been doing this work for longer. Becoming a therapist requires that you do some work as a therapist associate before becoming licensed. But in my licensure, I've been licensed for about 10 years. So it's been a while. Currently, I live in Sacramento, California, Northern California, and I have a private practice where I focus in working with first-gen and BIPOC folks. I work with individuals. I work with people in relationships, romantic relationships, but also I've had people with their chosen family have come into therapy because their living situation was having some challenges. So relationship therapy is not just for couples or people that are in romantic relationships, but I leave it open for other type of relationships as well. And in that, I also focus on working with adult families, which is also usually a lot of us think about family therapy being for little kiddos and their parents. But I find the value of holding the therapeutic space also for adults and sibling sets, parents, and adult children to come and talk about life. Sometimes it's about unpacking generational trauma, but sometimes it's also about building some foundations for like the future that they want to have with more intention. And so a lot of my work, even when I'm working with individuals, is about relationships, and it's about how we're connected to others visibly and invisibly, actively and inactively, and also how we belong to a society at large, that we're connected to people and to systems, both of support and oppression, that are constantly sort of influencing how we show up every day. So that's the work that I do. I was born in El Salvador. I came to the United States when I was 16 years old. And so that immigrant experience of being in the borderland between two worlds, between two cultures, between two of everything, definitely has been a journey, a process. and it really influences all the work that I do. And I think that's the reason also now that I do this therapeutic work and this like the relationship education that I do is with the lens of just how complicated our life experiences kind of get, and they get in the way of the way that we either romanticize relationships, that they should be all good all the time, or when we have like really toxic relationships, right? And so like my sort of duty is like, how do we find the middle ground as immigrants, as people of different generations, and all of that good stuff is the things that I do.
Whew, I think that
Yeah.
I am a huge advocate for mental health, but specifically for first generation, second generation, the Latina community, like
Mm-hmm.
just hearing you talk about all of the different um, parts of who we are and how
Mm-hmm.
we like navigate our own life, but also navigate in the world is so complex.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
it's like once you start pulling that thread and talking about it, it's like it unravels. And I always advocate for people to do that in partnership with a therapist. And
Mm-hmm.
so I I think even hearing you talk and explain what you do, if you are Latina, I think it is so important to have that connection with whoever you're working with, your
Mm-hmm.
therapist, psychiatrist, like that understanding of the Latina experience. And especially if you are an immigrant or first gen,
Mm-hmm.
second gen, it is so important and so huge
Mm-hmm.
because our experience is so complex and
Yeah.
it's not really understood if you haven't gone through that
Mm-hmm.
experience yourself. And
Mm-hmm.
so I am curious as to how you landed in this field because they're like you are also doing a lot of learning and unpacking
Mm-hmm.
and therapy work in your own life in order
Mm-hmm.
to help others. So, what
Yes.
guided your decision into this field?
Oh man, that's a loaded, interesting question because I feel that I landed in this field, like the field chose me in ways that now, 17 years later in the profession, right, that I understand. I was like, oh, this was sort of like guided from like an intuitive place for myself, but also kind of guided in the space that I'm gonna be most impactful in the world because I started college as a computer engineering major. People always laugh when I tell them that because I'm so talkative and I'm just like I'm like I love being a therapist. I love socializing and I love all these things. But also I have like this super nerdy, geeky part about myself that I also adore. But nowadays lives like more like in the closet more than the other like identities that I have. And so I started my journey in college as a computer engineer. And I did that for a couple of the years, but I just couldn't find myself. Like I couldn't find that there was joy. I actually started feeling pretty miserable. And I think now, thinking about those times, I was starting to get depressed, but I didn't have the language for it. But even taking it further back, my family experienced a separation in the 90s. I don't know how familiar you are with some of the political issues that Central America was going through in the 80s, but El Salvador had a huge civil war that displaced lots and lots of Salvadorian people to different parts of the world. And so my family was affected by that displacement, and my parents left the country in the early 90s, right before the peace treaties were signed. And so my parents made a really tough decision that they needed to leave my sibling and I in El Salvador with our grandmother, our paternal grandmother. And they came to the United States. And so we were separated for 9 years. I was 6 years old when they left, and they came back to a 15-year-old, almost 16-year-old into their lives. And so we struggled a lot because by default that I was the eldest daughter in my family, that my grandma was elderly. I had to be really independent, take care of myself, take care of my sibling. And so I think about like, how did I get into this field? Like what happened? And so I remember that when I started going to college in computer engineering major, I started taking a lot of sociology classes. And one of them in particular had to do with war and displacement and the way that war impacts society at large. And I was really interested in like figuring out like, oh, like this means something. Like I didn't even understand. I just thought that was just an experience that my country and my family had gone through. And so through the sociology classes, I started taking classes that were sort of helping me make sense of the world that I had grown up in, giving language, giving academic language, showing me data, telling me stories that my story wasn't the only one. And so when I started struggling in computer engineering, just because I think I was getting depressed, I kind of lean into the sociology majors and the classes because they were helping me just think about my world so differently. And so from there, I ended up changing my major to sociology instead of continuing the path in engineering. But to my surprise, I finished college and I was like, so what do people with sociology degrees do? Because at that point, it kind of like left my mind that I was going to school for like this purpose, that I needed to have a job eventually. I was just really enriched like myself. I was struggling a lot. I got kicked out of the university that I went to. I had like a 0.98 GPA just because I could not find my footing. I could not find myself. When I came back from that suspension from the university because my GPA was so low, I went to a junior college, came back. My professors in the sociology department, I had two professors that had gotten to know me really well, and they had kind of gotten to know my story, and they helped me started conceptualizing it, right? So from that, graduating, I literally went on monster.com back in the day, nonprofit job, because that's what I had heard. People with sociology degrees go to, go into nonprofit work. And I ended up working in a mental health clinic. And because I was a Spanish speaker, immediately I was like, there was like more job than I could do at that point. And seriously, at that point, I was just like, how was I qualified to do all of that? But it was like this organic, sort of natural way because of the experiences that I had survived, the things that I had gone through, and the way that I had started understanding that all of this stuff impacts people as individuals. It impacts the society, but also individuals. So while in that clinic, I was running a group for elderly folks that were immigrants, and it was such a beautiful experience to have people that like felt validated, that felt understood. And that's how I found my path into going to grad school in mental health. So all of this is very serendipitous because it's not like, oh, I decided I had this, dream once that I would become a therapist. No, like I had no idea that this is where I would end, but somehow I have ended exactly where I needed to be. And being a therapist is one of these really cool careers where you both are being of service and of help to others, but inevitably, like you said, you have to look inside. And so I think what I like the most about how all of this happened to me is that in sociology, I learned to think wide about the world. Why are these things happening? How does it impact people as a society? And then when I went into counseling and psychology, which is how you become a therapist, then I started seeing like this is how individually, having had all of these things around you happening, they show up for you and they impact your mental health. And so without really having like a predetermined plan, somehow these two majors, these two ways of thinking about people and about the world collided. And I found myself in, exactly where I needed to be. So that's the story.
That's amazing. I always love to hear when people follow the path that is placed before them. A lot of
Yeah.
times when we are first gen, we follow the path that someone else wants for us.
Yeah.
And eventually we realize like we get into this headspace where we may be anxious, depressed, overwhelmed, and it's because we are not actually following the path that we should be on. We're following
Mhm.
someone else's dream and just going through the motions. So I love that you are just open to following what was next, what felt right with you, and
Mhm.
being able to switch and pivot from what you had started going to school for and really just following what felt where you were needed in
Mhm.
sociology and in the mental health space as you continued your education. So that's like usually a story that people get to eventually, but
Mm-hmm.
I love that hope and that encouragement for people who are in school right now to just
Mm-hmm.
follow the path that feels right for them. And to, I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a lot of pressure on young people to know what they want to do right off the bat from like
Yes.
graduating high school, and they have to pick a major, and then like we are just going from an education that is kind of planned out for us to then
Mm-hmm.
like at the end saying you need to figure out how you're going to make money,
Yeah.
and there is not as much guidance or assistance. At least there wasn't when I was in college.
Yeah.
And so hopefully there is more now. And hopefully, as we get these conversations out there and share our experience, there will be more support for parents and the youth now, which I
Mm-hmm.
think when I hear about Gen Z, like they are rocking it out there.
Yeah, they are.
They know what they want. They are fighting for what is right, and it gives me hope and encouragement for the next
Yeah.
generations. Um,
Yeah.
but I think your Latinidad as a whole has really inspired your whole path, and
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to hear more about the when you were in the nonprofit
Mm-hmm.
sector and you saw this need for bilingual
Yeah.
assistance. How did that then impact you pursuing more education and then going into
Mm-hmm.
your own private practice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a twofold. It's a little bit of I wish that I could tell you this was like the like being bilingual felt like a gift. It didn't feel for a long time, and I'm going to tell you why from my perspective, because I actually found myself in a lot of circumstances that were very exploitative. And it would be like, there is nobody else that speaks Spanish. Can you take this case? There is nobody else that can take this case because they are immigrant and they have this particular thing. Can you take the case? And at that point, earlier in my career, right, like things like boundaries, things like intuition, like the way that we kind of like speak nowadays colloquially, like the therapy language is available. Even as a therapist, I went to grad school 2008, 2009. So even 10, 12 years ago, the language that we have now was not available to us, like was not available to me to kind of say like, hey, like I have too many cases. I actually was ridden with guilt. I would feel guilty when I would say no, because when I would say no, I would be saying no to a case that would look like my tia, that would look like my mom, that would look like my story, right? And so there was this way in which working in the nonprofit sector really led to me being burnt out and to doubt myself that I wanted to stay in this field because the cases were we call this vicarious trauma in therapy, and it was like trauma after trauma after trauma that being a therapist is very hard. It's hard work, and you have to have really good emotional boundaries and also be in your work to be able to sort of offload what's happening to you internally in your experience as you're consuming others' traumas and painful stories, right? And so if you don't have that emotional boundary, you end up almost getting re-traumatized. And because our stories as Latina folks are very similar, right? Like I could see myself, or I could understand that story from a way that felt really vivid and really convoluted inside, because along with being a therapist is different than being a case manager, right? When I work in positions where I'm a case manager and it's like resources, let me give you what you need, let me go find out what other place. As a therapist, a big job of the therapy is to sit with the pain and to just sit and do nothing. And not because you don't want to remedy the problem that is going with the person, but because the process of actually acknowledging and just holding that this is painful, that this impacts you, that part I think for me was harder earlier on because I just wanted to do. I wanted to do. And in the being in it, I just felt really exhausted and really burnt out. And so it has been a transformative journey to go from like that place where I remember like feeling overwhelmed and feeling overloaded to now being in my private practice where I'm making some intentional decisions about how do I show up for my clients, for my patients, who am I deciding to work with. And so in the process of being a nonprofit, right, I've done everything from doing food drives and toy drives for Christmas. And, during COVID, like I was out passing backpacks and laptops for kids because we needed them to connect to school and we didn't know how they would, if they had access. So we were like in full gear, face shields, masks, like delivering things at homes, going to drop off lunches for families that don't have cars and didn't have access. Like I've done it all in the face of like, how do you support people? And throughout, the biggest change that has happened for me is like, how do I maintain my boundaries? And also how do I honor that what I'm doing is enough? Because I think that's like a challenge that comes up for younger therapists or people in social services, is like that what we're doing is not enough. And it's because it will never be enough. As long as our societal systems continue to be oppressive and continue to enforce hardship on the communities that we're serving, right? We're not going to be able to do enough. And that is sort of a realization that we have to have with ourselves, that what I'm doing, considering the schema of what's going on in this planet, it has to be enough, because that is the bandwidth that you have to give. But finding that line is really hard when you're saying no to your community, when you're saying no to people that really have hardships and needs, right? And so how do you balance out your own boundaries and this need to help with sort of the realization that what you're doing is enough, and that in order to maintain yourself, and not at this sprint, but at the marathon of this work, that you have to learn to take some steps back, to prioritize also your mental health, to make sure that you are okay and that you are taking care of yourself just in the way that you're taking care of others, right? And so it has been for me a big journey of having this realization. So saying no to something means that I'm saying yes to something else that then allows me to go back into the community and do the work. But at the beginning, boundaries felt really, really hard to enact.
This conversation is relatable for even if you're not a therapist, because we turn on the news and just as individuals, we hear of so many traumatic events that are happening every day across the country. And we are like hearing of even migrants like in our own city seeking refuge. And like you said, there's only so much we can do, but we're still holding on to the reality and the emotions of what is happening. And it is, I think, during the pandemic years is when we were overloaded with overwhelmed, because we were in our homes for a long period of time. We were isolated from seeing other people, and we had nothing else but to hear of all of the disparities that were around us that we had not taken time to realize because we were in the hustle and bustle of life before. And so when like life stops and all we can do is listen and watch and pay attention, it's overwhelming. And so I think a lot of people were really trying to figure out how to place those boundaries, how to pour into their own mental health, because when life stops, you're forced to think about that. And I think we are still, even in the transition of 2022 to now, when things are opening up and you're getting back into like work on a regular schedule, and there's like hybrid working from home, we're still trying to figure out what is best for us and how to place boundaries, because it's easy to go back to life as it was before the pandemic and just say yes to everything. But then we're going to end up back in the same place. So how was your transition out of the nonprofit sector into opening your own practice? And how can we, as we continue to transition, because I mean, the reality of things is not going away. Like it
Yeah.
has been exposed with racism, with disparities in our
Mm-hmm.
communities, with even just being fearful of going out and sending our kids to school, or
Mm-hmm.
even just taking a walk in
Yeah.
at the mall. Like all of that is still at the forefront, and we can't stop living life, but like how do we
Mm-hmm.
balance the reality and our own mental health or boundaries? I know
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge question.
It's a
So
big question because in my favorite therapist answer is like, well, it depends, right?
yeah.
Because the circumstances and whatnot. But I think what's coming up for me, it has been a realization that I had as I was making this decision of transitioning from working in the public school system into my own private practice. When we are in the middle of our hardship, it is going to be very hard to prioritize our mental health or our dreaming, our what we would call self-actualizing, right? Becoming our best selves. We see it on Instagram and social media all the time, like, oh, hashtag living your best life. But in order to live your best life, it's like, do you have a roof over your head? Do you have food at the table? Do you have job stability? Do you have healthcare? Do you have, right? Like there's all these barriers that if we only think that we can achieve or that we should wait to work on our mental health or to pay attention, like, so let's not even work, to pay attention to it until all these things are stable, then what we're going to end up doing is kind of leaving our mental health last. Right. And so for me, my realization was that the pandemic, especially when you were working in the schools, and I think this was true for everybody in different ways, but for me as a first responder working in the schools and other people that were first responders, is that we didn't have a lot of room to prioritize ourselves during the pandemic because people needed us. We needed to be responding to like this gaps of need. And there was not an option to go home and hunker down. Like in some ways we could, but in some other ways we still had to be right in front of everything. Right. And so for me, what I realized was that I needed to go back inside and ask myself, how am I going to prepare myself for the long run of this career that I love so much and that I'm so good at? What changes do I need to make in my life to have the longevity? Because the pace that I've been running over the last 15 years is just not sustainable. I like to think about it from the perspective of sustainability, and sustainability is going to be very different at different ventures of your life. When you're 20 years old, sustainability is literally, do you have, sometimes like money to go buy top ramen and to buy like tortillas y queso for quesadillas, right? Like it's gonna be like about like that survival. Like I'm right here, I'm just surviving on the day to day. And so that's sustainability of like, how do I continue to work on my goals? How do I continue to work on myself under the current circumstances? I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves. What do I need right now under the circumstances? Not wait until things are better, because waiting until things are better may never come. And so deprioritizing our mental health or putting it in the back burner because X, Y, and Z is not happening, I think has been sort of a harmful dynamic that we've gotten into, especially for people in our culture as Latinas, right? Because we have kind of two concepts that I like to talk about that are two sides of the same coin. Machismo, which we're very familiar with, and we all talk about like the ways that, like, especially if you identify as a woman, you've been socialized as a woman, right? Like there are some very particular expectations about how you're supposed to show up. In the pandemic, that was one of the ways that machismo really started showing up in our families because for example, people who were parents, right? Like they had to like now redistribute labor, people, both parents in a meeting or a single parent with kids, and like, how do I do my responsibilities, right? And so the concept of like the expectations that we have for ourselves started showing up. But the second term that I think people don't talk as much is Marianismo, right? And Marianismo is the concept that women, we should, especially for women, we should our goal should be to meet the standard of the Virgin Mary and to be meek and polite and quiet and of service and of taking care of our family first, right? And that part has been such an added stress for female identified folks, for women, for mujeres that already are dealing with it, being in the 21st century, which is you're not staying home and just doing one thing. You're raising a family, you're taking meetings, you're, making dinner, like all of these things. And if you have a partner that shares that load, well, it almost feels like, like a little bit of a relief. But also our partners have had their own challenges through all of this time. And so how do we, when we think about sustainability, we think about, where am I right now in my mental health? Where are my current circumstances? What support do I need? Who are my support systems? Am I asking for help? And so step one, I think, is self-awareness. We have to be asking ourselves, like, what is it that I need in this moment? Because if we're not aware of those needs, we're just going to keep replicating the harm that we've learned growing up, the systems that are telling us we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to do that, or these values that seem so innocent, right? Like the idea that we should be of service to our families, it seems so innocent. But when it goes to an extreme and we're not aware of the sacrifices or the asks that come with living up to that value, then we're leaving ourselves on empty, running on empty to just give, right? And so I think like the question in itself is really complicated, but if I could give like folks one place to begin, I think, is in that self-awareness of like, where are you at? Are you clear about what your needs are? And are you being responsive in a way that meets your current circumstances, right? Self-care isn't always gonna go, let me go take a bubble bath. Self-care sometimes is like figuring out a better schedule to do the laundry. I always laugh because I talk about the laundry so much in therapy. It's like the chore that like gives me so many metaphors to life, because laundry is one of those things that never ends, right? And so for people that are doing laundry and they're just like leaving it until they have 8 loads, well, now you're going to spend like 10 hours doing laundry, right? And so you have to find a sustainable way to do your chore that never ends, because otherwise you pile it up. And by the time that you need to do the laundry, you're going to have to spend that much more time, that much energy, that much more effort, right? And so I like to think about the laundry of life. If we're taking care of the little loads as they come, right, instead of accumulating a month's worth of laundry, likely your response to this chore is going to feel a little bit easier, but it's also going to meet you in a place that is more realistic versus waiting until we're exhausted. And that's what's happening to a lot of people, and what's happening for me, and why I needed to leave the system that I was working in, because I was waiting until the eight loads of laundry needed to be taken care of to take care of me, because everything else that was going around me felt like a priority. And so going into opening up my own business gave me more autonomy and more flexibility to myself, that in order for me to do the work that I do, I have to also be well and taken care of. Otherwise, I'm going to be running on fumes. And I know that's not my best self, right? So long-winded therapy answer to the question of, it depends, right? Like what that looks like for every person.
I love the laundry analogy. It's always like laundry and dishes. Those things,
Uh,
those things.
I'm going to start asking about dishes. I don't think I ask about them enough.
Yes, and especially if you're like, I mean, the dishes pile up every meal. So that's like, and if I wait until like the end of the day, I don't want to do them. And then it piles up and it's there for me in the morning. And thankfully, my husband and I will like either he is too tired to do the dishes, so I'll do them, or vice versa. But I think especially during the pandemic, we realized the need for us to pour into the way we communicate and in the relationships that are the closest to us. And that is typically the family unit. And the family unit might look different. It might include, it might include multi-generational relationships. And which, I mean, I think it's so important to be able to really work on the way that you communicate. And I know that I took that time to reevaluate and reassess how I communicate with my children. And it was during that time that was really pivotal for us as a family unit to really talk about and create that safe space to talk about how
Mhm.
we communicate with each other. And it has
Mhm.
been a process over the past 3 years, 3+ years now. And I look like today, and I am just so thankful to be changing the way that we communicate from previous generations, because
Mhm.
it looks so differently. And
Mhm.
I talk about this with my husband, like the things that we're able to communicate and the relationship that we're able to build with our children is something that I wish that I had
Mhm.
with my family when I was
Mhm.
a child. And even like I mess up all the time. And I
Mhm.
know that I can always improve on communication. Sometimes I let my stress get to me and don't communicate very well. But just being able to have that space to for my children to be like, that's rude, like you didn't
Mhm.
need to say that, and then for me to be like, oh man, I'm sorry, I you're
Mhm.
right, you're right. Or to
Mhm.
for me to have the space to say, you know what, I'm really stressed right now, so I just need like no one to talk to me for 10 minutes, I need silence. um
Mhm.
has been huge. So
Mhm.
I am sure that like your business has really been thriving, because there's such a need, especially
Such a
for
need.
families and Latina families, to really deconstruct how they were raised
Yep.
and change the way that they communicate now.
Mhm. Mhm. You know, like I said, when I was trained, the majority of when we talk about family therapy was focusing on like young children and parents, right? But I have found that we have a gap in relationship health that is tied to mental health when it comes to adult families that have been socialized to just reenact and replay over and over dynamics that may or may not be fitting to the current situation or just may not be healthy overall, right? And so the idea of like having an adult sibling set that has had some conflict, or a parent who's in their 60s where an older child who, or with a child who's an adult who's in their 30s, like the type of conversations that I've been able to witness have been magical, because through those type of moments where people are bearing themselves to be vulnerable and to say, hey, like I got it wrong, and these are the parts that also I know I want to keep, but let's talk about it and let's renegotiate and let's find compromise of how do we navigate this better. How do I honor your pain? How do I honor the parts that have been hurt from the places that I didn't know in those conversations? So if anybody that's listening to this has been wanting or wondering, like I should take my sibling or my parent to go to therapy, you can do it. And you should, because I think about I'm turning 40 this year, right? And so I have this kind of joke of like, okay, like hitting like midlife, it feels good. I used to think 40 was old, but like the realization is still got on a good day another 40 years to live. My gosh, that's a long time. And unlike when we're kids, right? Like the majority of the first 40 is like we're kids, we're trying to figure out the world. This next 40 that I see coming up are like in full awareness of who I am, of my wants, my needs, my dreams. And it's really exciting, right? And so for people that might feel that it's too late to begin addressing some of these things that are just kind of feeling heavy in our hearts, it's never too late. It's never too late to begin to work on our relationships and to also to work on ourselves and to kind of have and I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the word let's do the work, but more so about getting intentional. I like to think about what is the work anyway? The work is getting intentional, figuring out what you want, figuring out why you want the things that you want, figuring out what your values are. And then to your point, how do I communicate that? Many times we talk about boundaries as kind of like the place to begin. Well, if you don't know how to communicate your boundaries, but you're also not aware of what those boundaries need to be or why do you need them, then you're kind of like starting in step 3, right? And so part of the work that I'm doing too in social media is around relationship health and kind of focus a little bit more on romantic relationships, just because in romantic relationships, you have the opportunity to sort of hit reset. You're having two worlds that are coming in, and then you can get intentional about what world do you build together versus like with our family of origin, there is so many layers that we're carrying, right? So in social media, one of the things that I focus on is on relationship health, romantic relationship health. How do you have conversations about mental health? Right now it's mental health month in May. And how are you talking to your partner about your mental health? But also that would be, how are you talking to your siblings about your mental health? How are you talking to your parents about your mental health, right? How do we communicate? And so one of the things that I did in March, and I'm ready to do again in June, is this relationship boot camp, what I'm calling a relationship boot camp, where it's just about learning the skills. What are the skills to be in a relationship? Because if you think that conflict management looks like in the novela, you are in for some high level arguing and fighting, right? Like, or if you think that the way that you resolve a conflict is by sending lengthy text messages that take like 4 scrolls, then you have some gaps in like how you're being socialized and what you've learned about communication, right? And so in the boot camp, or like the way that I've conceptualized it, what do we need in order to have healthy relationships and self-awareness, communication, boundaries? Then we need to know how to resolve conflict. What are the skills to resolve conflict? And then how do we keep our relationship in joy and alive and in happy, right? Because we don't think that we also need that part of like, when you're in a romantic relationship, romancing our partners, being romance, like those, we want them, right? As long as we are wanting to be in a relationship, like how do we effectively show up as the best versions of ourselves? And when we're not the best version because circumstances are going around us, then how do we communicate that? And how do we ask for what we need, right? And so all of that is kind of like the work that I'm doing now, that is stemming from therapy is not always accessible, and I understand that. And so how do I give people the skills that they may need, that they can start working on their own before going to therapy? I still always find the value, and there's resources that I would be happy to share after for the notes that people, can find affordable therapy and whatnot. But also, what are the skills that you can practice on your own? And so I know a lot of therapists and educators on social media are using that platform in that way. And yeah, so that's something that I'm really excited about building community, building healthy relationships, and just like honestly living your best life, right? Like that's what I want for everybody.
Yeah, I think what I love that you talked about social media, but partnered that with the intention, because it's
Yes.
easy for us to see all of these posts that we want. Yes, we want to live our best life. We want to set boundaries. We see that and we double click so that we can like that, or we click the save. But it takes us to make that intention to actually implement that in our lives, and to
Yes.
seek out the help that we need in order to get that. Because we can have a whole like catalog journal of affirmations and like saved posts, but
Mm-hmm.
if we're not doing anything to move forward or implement that into our own life, then it's not
Mm-hmm.
going to have the desired effect. And
Mm-hmm.
I think for that reason, community is huge, and having that support system where you feel like you're not doing it alone, because you might be the
Mm-hmm.
first person in your family to desire this or make the first
Mm-hmm.
move. And it's that community and that support that's going to help you to keep going if you're the only one.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, let's talk about being first gen and like healthy relationships too, because that's another way of being like the first generation. I grew up in a home where I know that there's some things that I saw in my home that I cannot replicate. Like, I know that for a fact, right? But then there is the middle ground of the things that don't feel as clear about, is that how I want to do my romantic relationship? Is that how I want to be in partnership? Is that how I want to parent, right? Because this is not about demonizing our parents or the generations before us. We also have to contextualize it that they themselves have had challenges and traumas and experiences that they have not gotten to resolve, to understand, to think about. And so much more compassion and love to the generations before us, and a healthy level of critical lens, right? Versus criticism is a critical lens that says, what about my family of origin do I want to carry over into my parenting, into my romantic relationship, into my, I think I'm a tia to 2 little girls. I personally am by choice childless, and don't want to have my own children, but I'm a tia to my siblings' kiddos and also to my friends' kiddos, right? And one of the things that I've gotten really excited about is that I want to be a tia, an auntie to like 30-year-olds. How fun will it be to be like an aunt to like a 25-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 40-year-old if I'm alive that long, right? Like that would be so cool because as they grow, I'm also growing, right? But I don't have good relationships with my aunts and uncles. They had their own families and they had their own lives, and it's understandable why they couldn't be around. But I get the opportunity to be in this role intentionally for my siblings' kiddos, but also for my friends' kiddos. And so we get to ask ourselves, what did we have in our family of origin that 100% is moving forward, or 100% needs to stay back because it's not healthy? But then the middle part, that's where the opportunity really lies to create these relationships that we really truly desire, that are healthy, that are supportive, and that can lift us up in the times when things are rough, right? And so if I could summarize my purpose, I think that that's what it is. It's like that we all deserve to be in families, whether by nature or by choice, that really support us, lift us up, and that we can show up and be the best version of us, right? And so that's what I love to do. I really love to do that work.
Man, if that is not a mic drop, I don't know what is. That is a perfect way to send people off from this episode. But I have loved this conversation so much. I know I could probably talk to you all day and
Probably could.
yes, continue the conversation because like this conversation is needed. Like we need to keep having conversations with each other and also having the words and the language to and the courage to have them with our families as well.
Mm-hmm.
I know you've given so much wisdom and so much encouragement and advice on this whole podcast episode, but if there was one tangible piece that you would give to the next generation as a tia, what would that be?
I think, and this is what I tell, so my cousins now are having like 20-year-old kiddos that I get to be a tia to, which is also really, really cool. And usually the advice sounds the same, which is slow down a little bit and get intentional. There's a long life to live. So just slow down just enough that you can look around your mirrors, right? Like if we're driving, if we're going really fast, you kind of only have your eyes in front of you because you have to for safety. But if you are going to take a detour, if you're going to, kind of figure out where you're going, you need to go at a slow enough pace that you can look at the mirrors, what's here, what's there, to look at your map, right? That you're going to take the right exit. And so the slowing down, we're very push right now, I think, especially as first, second gens, of like living up my ancestors' wildest dreams, right? I think my ancestors' wildest dreams would have been to lay down under a tree with a nice little shade and an hamaca drinking some cold water, because these folks were out on the fields working. So I think that we have confused the hustle with the living our best life. And that's kind of like my last little gem of just like, what would be your ancestors' wildest dreams, honestly, though? Is it just work? Like, I don't know that people will overwork, want one more work for their dream. Actually, having the privilege and the luxury of slowing down and like, what do I want to do with the time that I have on this planet and this earth and this moment, right? Like, how do I want to show up and to make decisions then that are informed by that honesty of heart, of soul, of mind, and that desire to just, have a better life and to give ourselves, but also give to others, that best part of us, right? And I think that can only happen if we really understand what's going on, and that requires that we slow down a little bit.
So good. And I always love to cheer on my guests in what they're working on and what they're doing. So, do you have any big goals that we can be excited for you in your business?
Well, the biggest goal that is actually, I think, a mutually benefit goal is that I'm doing my second round of the relationship bootcamp this coming June, and then probably in the fall another round. And so, if you're looking to develop some skills, I really think the program that I've put together has that intention of like almost like guided self-help, that you get to hear me explain some of the concepts of therapy, some of the concepts of relationship education that are that have more nuance than just reading an Instagram quote. I always have such a myself a relationship with social media because I say this, but let me tell you all that I think about this one topic, right? And so through this bootcamp that I offer, I get to not only give you a bunch of skills, so like an intentional program of Instagram quotes, but you get to hear from me explaining the concepts and so sort of leaving people with the ability to think a little bit more deeply about what's going on with them, and then hopefully encourage them to go do their work with a professional if they wanted to do so. But that's like my biggest project that I'm working on. The rest of the stuff, I teach at the University of San Francisco and I do a lot of community work. And so that kind of keeps going. But for folks in the audience, that probably would be the most beneficial project that I have coming up.
Perfect. And where can people connect with you and find you and all of your upcoming events?
Yeah, the bigger, the most intentional place that I show up online is Adriana Rodriguez Wellness on Instagram. And so it's just my name, Adriana, 1N, Rodriguez with a Z, and then the word wellness all together. And then if you're interested in therapy and you're in California, then you can go to my website, Adriana Rodriguez Therapy, adrianarodrigueztherapy.com, and that's where you can find me.
Perfect. I have loved this conversation so much, and I think it is going to be really beneficial for all of my listeners. So I really appreciate your time and
Thank you.
And sharing everything that you did. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate for you to give me this opportunity to amplify this message because I'm really passionate about it, and I know that also folks need the information that I'm being intentional about putting out, and so I appreciate the opportunity in this space.
Yes, I'm so encouraged by people like you who are doing all this work in order to pour back into your own community and this next generation. We are doing a lot of work to pour into them, and I am really hopeful and encouraged for the generations to follow.
Me too.
All right. Well, we will probably see each other in Akita's co-working hangout, but hopefully we'll get a chance to meet in person sometime. Mm-hmm. But until then, I will say goodbye, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Adriana was such a great guest to end this season, and I encourage you to connect with her and check out her bootcamp this month. Okay, amigos. Next week, I'm closing out season 7 with one more episode. So after you listen today, feel free to take a screenshot, post on Instagram, and tag at Elevating La Cultura or send me a DM. You can also comment on this YouTube video if you're watching online. I always like to hear from people and how they resonate with the stories that I share. So leave a review on Apple Podcasts so we can get more ears listening to these stories and we can continue elevating La Cultura. And if you haven't joined yet, join the Facebook group where we can continue the conversations we have on the podcast. So if you're wanting another way to connect with me and stay in community, especially in between seasons, join us on Facebook. All right, enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, evening, whenever you're listening, y nos vemos next week for the closing episode of season 7. Bye.